This is Restless. Welcome back to Restless, the postmortem on the young, restless, and reformed. The summer interview series goes on, and we are welcoming back for a second interview this summer, Brad Vermurlen. Brad, Pastor Michael, welcome back.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm thankful that we have Brad again because we always have some very interesting conversation with our expert scientists of the new Calvinism front.
Yep. Brad Vermurlen is the author of The Reformed Resurgence, which is a book on the new Calvinism put out by Oxford Press. And it is an excellent book that dives into this subject from a sociological lens and has offered us a lot of interesting conversations in the past. And so today we're actually talking about something with Brad that, from what I understand, did not get as much focus in your book as it might have, but the experience, the sociology of some of the major new Calvinist churches.
Right. Yeah. It's part of my data gathering was what's called participant observation, which is essentially going and being with people and observing and participating as much as you can. And I would go home and write thorough notes, and then later I'd go back and I'd analyze those notes. And so, it was quite the process.
So how long were you attending churches? Tell us about this field research you did.
Right. So the participant observation is only one of three types of the data I gathered. So the other two are content analysis of materials I could find, and then also like interviews. Right. But for the actually going and being with people, it started in the fall of 2012. I flew from where I live near Detroit out to Seattle to do this work at Mars Hill Church with where Mark Driscoll was. So I was there for 2.5 months. I moved into a house with a few other guys that I didn't know before I flew out there, and I was a grad student, so my full-time job was to go to as many church events as possible and to take thorough notes and to reflect on what this might mean for the project, right? So I did that for 2.5 months, and then flew home for Christmas. And then that winter, January, February, I rented an apartment in the financial district of Lower Manhattan, where the two sides of the subway system meet for the first time. So it was a great spot in the city. I could go up either side of Manhattan real easily, and I did 2 months at Redeemer Presbyterian Church, Keller. And then I took about a month off, I think. And then I moved into another place right on the Mississippi River right on the edge of downtown Minneapolis for another 2 months. And I did the same thing at Bethlehem Baptist Church, where John Piper was or is. So, and again, it was aside from interviewing people, it was just to go to as many church events as possible and take thorough notes and think real hard about how this might feed into what would eventually become my book.
Pastor Michael, have you been to these churches?
Yeah, so Matt and I have talked about at some point, using this podcast as an opportunity for us to just discuss the times that we've had at some of these churches, because we've talked maybe a little bit about it, but we've kind of been saving it. So now we can finally divulge. So I've spent some time at Bethlehem Baptist. I've been to a couple of campuses there. I've known people that have worked at the church and been at the Bethlehem College and Seminary at a class or two during a visit once. And so I've been around that a little bit more. I did go to one service at a Mars Hill campus when I was out visiting some friends out in Seattle, right across the Puget Sound from Seattle. And we took the ferry in for the day into Seattle, and we stayed around. I think it was a Saturday. And so we went and caught a Saturday evening service at one of the campuses near wherever the ferry took us. So I couldn't tell you exactly which one. I don't remember, but we went to one of them.
Yeah. I likewise, in my good old New Calvinist days, went to church at the Ballard campus of Mars Hill and have been to Bethlehem Baptist once or twice. So we all have some experience there. Brad, you talked about interviewing even congregants. What was there anything striking that came out as you just kind of talked to the people who were there before we get into the church services themselves, which I think, yeah, I'd want to hear your feedback on.
Right. So maybe to clarify, I talked with congregants while I was at these services, but I only formally did an interview for my project with either religious leaders or with people who were kind of in a serving or leader position at these churches. So it'd be something like the tech guy or the video guy at Mars Hill would be an example of somebody who I might approach and say, hey, like, especially when I was just starting out, like, hey, can I do an interview with you? So I wasn't just interviewing any random congregant at these churches, but I did interact with them, and I talked with them in the lobbies and stuff. And it could be a little awkward, right? When they're like, oh, so how long have you been in town? And I'm like, a week. And, oh, well, why are you here? I'm studying your church. So it was.
What was the reaction to most people when you would say stuff like, well, I'm studying the church, or I'm here to research?
Right. I mean, some people, I guess, didn't care or didn't understand what was going on, but others would ask me, about my research and if I, what discipline I was in or what my hypothesis was or something like that.
I just wonder if people hear that, if they're like, especially if you're a church that's got some, I think especially maybe like a Mars Hill, where you've got some controversy going on around the church. You're in the news, not that few times. So if you have somebody there that they're like, hey, I'm researching your church, I just wonder if there were ever people who were a little bit, worried about that or concerned about what you were doing.
Only once or twice did I have somebody who was really standoffish, but normally it was quite receptive.
Cool.
Yeah. I mean, at Mars Hill, I happened to move the place where I moved to. The closest campus was Shoreline, and that's about 8 or 10 miles north of downtown. And at the time, Mark Driscoll happened to be teaching at the Wednesday night youth group. I don't know why. I guess he just liked teaching the youth group. And so I was able to bike up to youth group on Wednesday nights and hear Driscoll preach to a bunch of teenagers, which was something else. And I was able to get talk with him right away. So it was kind of understood. So I didn't get much, I had a pretty easy time at Mars Hill.
If only there were audio of those messages. I've heard you mention, and I think you say in the book, that actually just a kind of a sizable number of the people you happen to interact with weren't really sure what Calvinism was. Is that am I getting that correct?
Right. So when somebody would ask me, what's your project on? I just didn't feel like I wanted to get into a bunch of stuff about religion in the modern world and field theory and secularization, right?
Yes.
I just didn't want to go there. And so I would just come back with, well, it's on Calvinism. Do you know what Calvinism is? And most people would say, yeah, or like, yeah, I understand. But a sizable minority didn't know what Calvinism was. And so that's a little factoid that actually ended up in my book as one of the causal mechanisms that helped to explain the New Calvinist movement, is that a sizable minority of the lay people who make up the substance of this religious movement didn't actually know that they were part of a movement for Calvinism.
I've actually heard that. Now, I don't know if it was after or before, talking to you the last time. I remember you saying that, or maybe reading it. And I've had at least a couple conversations where people have mentioned, oh yeah, like in my church, this New Calvinist church, growing up in it, like most people didn't know what Calvinism was or whatever. So I've definitely heard that elsewhere as well.
And so you mentioned meeting Mark Driscoll, telling him about this. What did the leaders of the churches think about having a sociologist there for 2 months researching?
Well, the thing is, I well, this isn't the question you asked, but I'll answer it. So I emailed each church beforehand, asking them if I said, hey, I'm a PhD student in sociology, wanting to write my dissertation on the New Calvinist movement. Can I come study your church for 2 months? And they all either didn't answer or answered no.
Interesting.
Really?
Yeah, but I went anyway
because
it's a church. And
what are they going to do? Say I can't go to church, right?
Yeah. So I went anyway for each one, and it only it varied in time between 1 week and 4 weeks to how long it took me to actually be able to sit down with one of the pastors and do a formal interview for the project. So it took a little bit of effort on my part to look for somebody who was in charge and try to approach them and try to figure out like who to talk to and how I could get them to participate in my project, so to speak, because having already gotten a no or ignored. But it ended up, all three ended up being very hospitable and, being very cooperative with my project. Actually at Mars Hill, the last 2 days I was in Seattle, they gave me the second to last day, they gave me a guided tour at the B52, is it B50 building, where it was like it wasn't one of their places where they meet for worship, but it was like the headquarter building, right? Where they do the video production and they make their albums and stuff like that. And all their staging is stored and all the work, everybody who's kind of on their laptops working on a day-to-day basis, that's where the central offices are. So they gave me a guided tour of that building. And then the next day they let me come in and just kind of shadow them for a work day. So it was that level of hospitality and access, I guess. So yeah,
that is interesting. I guess the Notre Dame sociologist is a bit maybe not the guy you want hanging around until you meet him, and he's a nice guy. But what the thing you mentioned in our first interview that I wanted to talk more about, that I thought was really interesting and that I thought our listeners would be interested in, is when you went to these church services, you mentioned that you were looking for what they were communicating in everything but the sermon. Right.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? What is a sociologist looking for in a church service?
Right.
Way?
Well, I mean, not every sociologist chooses to approach it the way I chose to approach it, but basically I already had pretty good familiarity with each of these three churches in terms of their sermons, right? Because they're and I knew they were accessible online, and I knew that any church service I was in, some version of that sermon, if not that exact sermon, would end up online. And if I needed to, I could go back and listen to it for any information I needed. And so I just kind of made a strategic decision whenever I would attend weekend services to pay attention to everything except the sermon. So it was, I don't always do that at church. Sometimes I do still, but it did make for a kind of a unique way to experience a weekend service. So, and a lot of times I would just like not even be in the main auditorium or sanctuary or whatever you want to call it, and I would go, out in the lobby and try to strike up conversations with people, that type of thing. And I would always make sure to show up early and stay late. So yeah, you guys are pastors, the types of things that any evangelical church is doing, lots of stuff from, programming and music and getting everything in order and everything that goes into just doing a typical weekend service.
Yeah. And I find the idea striking. Right. There's the statement from the ancient church, which is Lex Orandi, Lex Credendi, right? The law of praying is the law of belief. And right, the church has believed historically that what you do, what you sing, what you worship, what you pray is going to be what you believe. And that's why when you made this comment, I watched what they were communicating in everything but the sermon, I found that very striking and helpful, because I think it is, often when we think about, well, what does my church believe? We often don't think, well, what do we say with just everything we do? All these things that you mentioned, right, that are going on at a church on Sunday, in the service, in the programming and all of that. And I found that interesting.
Right. So I was looking at everything from the aesthetic of the room, the physical layout of the main room and the other rooms, the way people were dressed, the groupings of people that came, whether, I was trying to judge if this is mostly at various churches, is this mostly a blue collar crowd or like an upper middle class crowd based on appearance, as far as you can judge that. I was trying to strike up conversations with people in the lobby. Music was something I was, I could pay attention to like anybody else. The liturgy, especially at Redeemer Presbyterian liturgy, was more pronounced than at the other two. And other things like, you're allowed to bring your coffee in at Mars Hill, but you're actively not allowed to bring your coffee in at Redeemer, and they make you throw it out. And like they had on the west side at Redeemer, they had a beautiful new building, 5-story building they had just finished a couple of years prior, and like just explore. I would just go walk the hallways and like ask like, so what's this room used for, and that type of thing. So, but yeah, it was and parking. Bethlehem knows they have a problem with parking. Not much parking at their downtown campus. But yeah, so I was looking at, even everything down to like, I know this is kind of a strange thing, but like the size of people's diamond rings and stuff. Like, sure. Because I would notice at different campuses of Mars Hill, there was distinct socioeconomic differences in the people, depending on which campus you were at, based on just like their haircuts and the size of their diamond rings and the cars they were driving. So that type of thing.
Interesting. Can we go into maybe detail about, kind of each one? Like, let's talk through, these different churches, or do you have something else, Matt?
I do want to do that, but this is a question about kind of all three of them together. Because I guess I didn't know this. Are they all three churches with multiple campuses? Do they all do that? And do they handle it the same?
In a sense, yes, they're all multi-site churches. They approach it slightly differently. So Mars Hill, as I'm sure you guys might know, at first called them campuses, and then they, because of their definition of church, started to refer to each one as a separate church, even though it was still technically and legally all one organization. So they called them campuses, and then they called them churches, but they were functionally the same thing. At Bethlehem, I believe they just called them either sites or campuses. And then at Redeemer, they called them congregations. And then they, it was a little different. So Tim Keller would rotate quasi-randomly, I guess, between the three. At the time, it was 3 congregations in the city, because they told me they didn't want people just going to whichever congregation they knew Keller would be preaching live at. So he would just randomly bounce around the 3 sites, the three congregations, to kind of minimize that.
And did they all use video to the other sites or campuses?
No. So Redeemer did not. I think they would kind of write their sermons almost together, and they would deliver almost the same sermon live at each. So whenever Keller wasn't preaching at a certain congregation, the lead pastor at that particular congregation would preach functionally the same sermon. At Mars Hill, it was, I think, mostly video, although sometimes it wasn't. And it was, I think, even more so video at Bethlehem, if I remember correctly.
Sure. At the time when I was there, I've been there a couple of times where I was told that Piper did kind of move around at different times to the different campuses, but it was all video then from wherever that was.
Right. Yeah. And when it's video, that's even more incentive for me to pay attention to everything except the sermon, because I knew this is is going to be online later. I can go do what other things that I can't do at some other time. Right.
Right.
So,
yeah. So let's talk about them, each individually. I guess we can go East Coast to West Coast. So let's start with your experience, and the one that Michael and I don't have any familiarity with as what it was like there. Obviously, Michael and I have both listened to plenty of Tim Keller's sermons and material, but we've never been at any of the congregations in Manhattan with Redeemer.
Right. Yeah. And I should say, I mean, there's these things that are always in flux, right? So I think now they went from 3 to 4, and then they became what's called particularized congregations or churches in the PCA. So I'm talking about it kind of back when I was there. Things have changed. Mars Hill it's changed a lot.
Defunct.
Yeah. So at Redeemer, they had 3. They had their brand new 5-story building on West 83rd Street, which was beautiful. It was kind of modern marble and white and clean lines and that type of thing. A pretty narrow building, but it's surprisingly roomy once you were sitting down in the sanctuary. They had another one that was an auditorium at Hunter College on the Upper East Side. If I remember correctly, it was East 69th Street. And then they had I don't know if it's still the same building, but they were using the Salvation Army building on 14th Street, so farther down Manhattan. So those were the 3 at the time. They added a 4th, like I said, in Lincoln Square, and maybe more now. I don't know. And so the thing that struck me, and they also have central offices close to Times Square. That is where they have their counseling services and all their offices and that sort of thing. That's a 4th kind of location, but it's not where they do worship services. Although they did have like people in their 20s would go there for like a worship night on a Thursday or something, right? So it was a little bit open to that type of thing. But the thing that struck me most, I think, when I first walked into a Redeemer service as a sociologist was, and I say this in the book, it felt like a privilege just to be there. And part of that, I mean, I don't know if you've ever been to Manhattan. Personally, I love Manhattan. I think it's a lot of fun. My wife says we can't move there, but just when you come in from the airport and you walk up from the subway for the first time, and you just there you are in the middle of Manhattan. I just love that feeling, and I just really enjoy being in Manhattan. And but then you walk into the Redeemer, any of these Redeemer buildings, and they're not all owned by Redeemer, like I said, but it's just like a lot of them have like this kind of really upper class feel, like clean lines, sleek lines, everything's clean or marble with like I remember at the 14th Street location, I think they call it downtown, everything had this kind of golden hue to it, which just struck me as like really like classy, I guess. I don't know, that's just how I felt at their locations. It just felt very Manhattan. You think about like this kind of professional class, polished, on your A game. And that's what it felt like a lot of times at these services. Not just the physical aesthetics of the building too, but like, how the leaders were dressed, and you have the grand piano, and you have just everything was really buttoned up and put together. And I mean, like I said, I think in another episode, a good church strategy isn't for everybody, but it's for some people. And I think it worked well, and it's still working well for where they are. So that's the first thing I noticed.
I think that is really interesting. I have been to Manhattan, and that sounds like something you would find in Manhattan, just in general. The aesthetic you're describing sounds like what you would find there in an upscale place, a professional place. Well, what about the liturgy? You mentioned earlier in our conversation that was the place with the most notable liturgy.
Right. So you would get a paper handout that you would hold with you throughout, and it would have the liturgy on it, like you get at a lot of Presbyterian churches, with the readings and, the kind of the flow of what we're doing throughout the service. So I think if you were just like a typical evangelical going to hear Tim Keller preach, maybe you wouldn't expect that, for it to be kind of a classic Reformed liturgy, and to have it felt almost like, not old school, but kind of like almost mainline, to like have a printed bulletin, I guess, of the liturgy. And
did their music match that? Did their music match that, or was?
Yeah, it wasn't like, thundering CCM music by any means. It was like piano, kind of. They talk about, I think on their website, they might still list, like, they have like jazz and eclectic and classical type music. So very like you're in an art gallery feel almost sometimes. So, and then you'd have people that performing solo singing and stuff. So it was all very polished and well done. Maybe not everybody would feel comfortable in that type of setting, but yeah, obviously they're doing something right. So
yeah, that's interesting. Well, let's come to the Midwest. Let's come to near Michael's home on the Mississippi River, Bethlehem Baptist Church with John Piper. What is that experience? And you can contrast them if you want to.
Right. So I say in the book that I'm from Michigan, and I'm a lifelong Midwesterner. And I don't know if it's because I'm a lifelong Midwesterner or what, but to me, some of the services and buildings at Bethlehem felt kind of nondescript, if that makes sense. Like they don't have other than just Midwest Minneapolis or whatever, they didn't have like a distinct mood to them.
Yeah.
I guess if you were from Manhattan or Seattle, you'd go there and you'd kind of get the Midwestern vibe, where it's just like, thin gray carpet, white walls. We're gonna have guitar, drums. It's like, I don't know. I mean, you guys have been there. Am I missing anything?
No, that sounds right. I mean, so I'm sitting here thinking about my own experiences again, trying to remember, and because even what you said with when there's kind of a video projection of a sermon, you can focus on everything else. That's how I felt when I was at these places, when there was video projection. Like I honestly was doing, mostly I was looking around and seeing what was going on.
You aren't a sociologist. You don't have the
I know I don't have the credentials to do that, but I just was. I don't know if that makes it a sin for me or not.
You're still allowed to look around, I think.
Yeah. But I was thinking about how there are a lot of very particular things about the aesthetic and about other aspects like that I can think of with Mars Hill. And I remember very little from Bethlehem Baptist, and it's probably because it's so just culturally normal for me, right? I was there with all these people that I know because they go there, and it was it's like kind of just up the road from where I live, and it was not that. It just wasn't that nothing stands out, I guess.
Yeah, that's kind of how I am too. I mean, I'm from Michigan, but I guess maybe if you're from another place, maybe Texas or the South or something, if you were to go up there, it might feel different. But for me, it just was kind of what I would expect from a building like a Baptist church.
Right. And obviously Baptists tends towards low church, right? They're not going to go towards these, more ornate buildings or things, at least in the Midwest. And, I've wondered, this is the only church that I think predated the founder, right? Tim Keller goes and he plants Redeemer. Mark Driscoll plants Mars Hill. Well, John Piper comes to an established Baptist church, right? This is a church that has existed just as a church for a long time. It has obviously it grew a lot with him there as the pastor, but it makes sense that one is going to feel like, oh, this is a pretty normal evangelical Baptist church, because it was that before it became one of the sites of, a new Calvinist celebrity.
Yeah, they did have a really big bookstore
Mm.
in their main downtown building, a pretty good size bookstore, bigger than the other two. So
Yeah, that is notable. That maybe I don't go to a lot of big churches, but the only churches I can think of that I've seen with bookstores are Bethlehem Baptist and well, I guess I've been to where R.C. Sproul's church was. They have a very, very large bookstore. They're not really in this conversation, but and then Mars Hill. Those were mostly Mark Driscoll books, to be fair. Bethlehem Baptist was a much wider selection, but yeah, that was a distinguishing thing for me, at least.
mm-hmm. And they had a lot of they had expanded their building at the downtown location, and so it was quite spacious. I mean, tens of thousands of square feet of meeting and office space. So that was yeah.
Wow. And inside their service, what compared to Redeemer, nondescript or?
I mean, it was a bigger space. You had more room. I mean, that's not surprising. It's Manhattan, right? Like I said, at Redeemer, it was pretty. It just felt kind of. It was a narrow space,
Mm-hmm.
and you were kind of facing sideways from this, like in orientation to the street. It was kind of a weird. They got creative with their space, but at Minneapolis, it was a bigger. I mean, I would guess it was an 80 or 90 foot tall apex of their sanctuary.
Yeah, it's pretty open. Huh.
They have the balcony. So
yeah, and then they followed the music. It obviously isn't. If I'm remembering, it's not jazz. It's not classical. It's more. I don't know if the right word is typical evangelical worship music.
It was like unenergetic CCM.
Okay. Right. Yeah, a little more contemporary songs that can feel like a hymn, right? We're not going to go all the way and get members from the band Emery and other rock bands from Seattle to come, but
yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Did you have any sense of, you said, right? Did you have any sense of if the attenders is this middle class, Midwestern? Is that kind of the grouping?
Yeah, middle class, maybe upper middle class, families that are comfortable. So, I mean, it wasn't a bunch of blue collar people by any means.
Yeah. Michael, is there anything you want to add with what your memory, if there's anything distinguishing about John Piper's and these churches, these campuses?
I was talking once to a pastor in the Minneapolis area, near Bethlehem Baptist, and it was right around when Piper was going to be retiring, and he mentioned that they were expecting at their church, once Piper retires, a large influx of young men with polos and khaki pants. Like that's what they were expecting to see. And I just feel like, polo, khaki pants, and kind of laid back Midwestern, like that sounds pretty much about right, from my experience. And I had a great time. I do remember it as like, I mean, I'm Presbyterian, so I'm used to now having a very distinct liturgy. We have it, printed in the bulletin. You know exactly what's coming up. All the parts of it. It's pretty much, more or less the same every week with little variations. And it seems like what I remember mostly in most evangelical churches, and probably it seems Bethlehem Baptist too, is, you've got the sermon and singing, and there's prayers like interspersed probably, but like this is like it's kind of built around. Everything's built around the sermon, right?
Yeah, that is probably one of the most notable things there, is that it is, in all of these to a degree, certainly more so, I think, just with the sermon lengths at Bethlehem Baptist and Mars Hill, they were built around the amount of time that was used for the sermon, an hour, right, each. Which is why I always felt ripped off if I bought a Tim Keller sermon and it was then 30 minutes. I couldn't believe I could watch. Anyways, okay, so let's go to the West Coast with Mars Hill, the churches. Brad, how many of their campuses did you attend in that time?
I could piece it together if I looked at the appendix of my book, but if
Sure.
I just off the top of my head, it's either 7 or 8, I think.
Wow.
How many were there? I don't remember. I mean, I
Well,
don't know that I ever knew.
I think I went to all of them in the Seattle area, but there were some out of state, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I went to
Albuquerque.
all but one in the greater Seattle area. And this was I was getting around by, bus and taxi at the time, so this was before Uber really took off. So it wasn't easy.
No.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I went to pretty much all of them in the greater Seattle area. And as you guys would probably know and expect, it's a non-denominational church. So they're kind of free to do what they want. And it had a distinct mood and aesthetic to it, which was largely defined, I think, by the personality of Mark Driscoll. There was variation by campus, which we can talk about. But I mean, overall, it was hour-long sermons that were, attention grabbing and well articulated. The music was thundering and very impressive, in my opinion. The colors, a lot of the time, it was either like dark and moody or like neon blue and arresting, or and like really like stuff that you kind of are forced to notice. So the coffee was free and good, and it was just kind of really comfortable, almost like hipster feel to it. In the book, there was an article in the Atlantic some years back. It was playing off the concept of the metrosexual, and this article was about something called the lumbersexual, where people dress like lumberjacks. And it was like this kind of urban professional lumberjack aesthetic. And I was like, okay, yeah, a lot of beards, like beards partnered with like vests, and so you saw a lot of that. And it was, younger guys and maybe with their wives and kids, but it was like almost the place to be on a Saturday night if you were a Christian. So it was cool. A lot of them felt really like cool places. So yeah.
Yeah, the one I went to, so it was, we were visiting from out of town. It was a smaller campus because it wasn't huge, but even, a smaller campus. It was probably, over 100 people on a Saturday night, Saturday evening service. And it was a campus where the band King's Kaleidoscope was playing. So they led the worship, and, so it was very much this, kind of concert feel. But what I remember most distinctly is, number one, it was very dark, right? The way that they lighted everything. It was, you walk in and it's very dark. And then there's certain areas, right? Like over here by the coffee, they've got more light. Over here they had a book table. It's a bit more light, but otherwise it's just a very dark feel to it. Very cool. It felt cool. But when we went, so I was in our group, I was wearing flannel. And I was also carrying around a video camera because we had been filming some stuff during the day just for fun, like as friends. And so I just was carrying a video camera, and I had these, it's basically the same glasses I have now, kind of thick black rimmed glasses. And so I walked in, and I had like 2 or 3 of there were, I think, 2 campus pastors and an intern that came up and talked to me. They didn't talk to anyone else in the group. And we were laughing about it afterward, that we were just like, yeah, like I seemed like the perfect target audience for what was going on, right? Like just the way that I looked like the kind of person that you would expect to try to connect with at this church.
Right. And I kind of fit that too. And I talk about in the book briefly that, I had an easier time at Mars Hill than other people might have just based on how I look. I'm a white guy with a beard. And so I kind of know I didn't stand out if I was like, in a wheelchair or an ethnic minority or something like that. Right. So it was, there's that going on. And you did sometimes get, I would get approached. I think they train at least the deacons to approach people and to like,
it was very clear that they were looking for people, which I do as a pastor, right? I'm not talking that. Like I notice when there's new people in the church, and they're the first people I go to talk to it, after a service. So it makes sense to me, but it was very clear that I was targeted very clearly, and we were just laughing about it after the fact.
Mhm.
Also, and when I was there, not only was it, preaching on a screen, so this, so everything's very dark, right? And you did all this music, and then very slowly, without any announcement, the screen just slowly comes down, and then it starts playing. So not only was it that, but this was also, they were playing video that had been pre-recorded when Mark Driscoll had done like some kind of tour. I think he was doing like the churches of the 7 churches in Revelation. And he had like toured the spots where those churches were, and then speaking on that from those places. And so it was also just a pre-recorded video, which I was personally nonplussed with, even at the time when I was, at least kind of into what Driscoll was doing. I just remember thinking, well, it's just weird.
It does feel kind of weird to, sit in a big room with 200 people watching the same, I guess they used to call them movie theaters, right?
Right.
But, so yeah, like I said, it gave me the opportunity to do everything other than listen to the sermon. But, and it was usually dark. Yeah. And so, I mean, a lot of times I couldn't see much of what was going on in the main auditorium. So I would go out in the hallway and try to talk to people, whether that was pastoral staff trying to get an interview or something. So, and there was variation by campus in the Seattle area too. So, I mean, Rainier Valley, the pastors there even told me like they were very aware that it was a very economically and racially diverse area, different languages, and I think it was as far as I remember, it was the only campus that was, I think it was majority non-white, if I remember. So it was smaller, lower socioeconomic status campus. Ballard was kind of the downtown hipster campus. Bellevue, over the water, is much more upper middle class, double income family area. So the University District, was mostly university kids, which had its own cool feel to it, in an old building, which was great and cool. Yeah, and then the West Side campus felt pretty nondescript in my view. For Seattle, at least, it had the same mood and same things going on. But I mean, relatively for a Mars Hill campus, it was, just pretty nondescript. Shoreline was like a suburb, like I said, eight or so miles north of downtown, and that was actually an old renovated elementary school, and it kind of was hard to get away from that feeling of like I'm in an elementary school.
Huh.
So,
sure,
yeah,
it's really interesting is as you describe these places. Obviously, there's some degree of diversity, but right, John Piper and Tim Keller are the intellectuals that I would have said I respected, and certainly deservedly so. But the churches we wanted, right, that Acts 29 was planting predominantly, were based on the Mars Hill model, right? That was kind of the mold of these churches, is that maybe the doctrine will be, and this is what I find so striking, is that the doctrine will be Calvinism. And I have wondered if that the Calvinism used to come inside the confessional Presbyterian box, which probably Redeemer most closely resembled, even though it had its own different intricacies. And we were now putting it into, these different containers, whether it's Bethlehem Baptist, maybe that's more typical. Obviously, Mars Hill is a very different aberration, we're going to take conservative Calvinism and put it here. And I've always wondered what the service, what the aesthetic communicates, how well that matches the conservative evangelicalism and Calvinism that was supposed to go along with it. The only thing I'll add about Mars Hill, because I should get both of your thoughts on that question, is I remember just being really struck. I was at the campus where Driscoll was, but I remember being really struck the take your own communion when you were ready. They had little communion stands set up, and they had wine and non-wine. And it was the first time growing up as an evangelical I'd ever seen wine offered with communion, and the first time I'd ever seen it, like you just walk up when you're ready at the end. And I just remember this very individualistic, and again,
So it wasn't even like part of like, hey, just when you're ready, come on up. We're all doing communion now. It was like, hey, also don't forget your communion.
Correct. Yeah.
Wow.
That it's always there and available at, or maybe they'd put it out certain weeks, and that was, just happened to be when I was there. But
I think it is notable that Marsville did do, if I remember right, they did do communion every week, which is relatively rare in low church evangelicalism. But it was that kind of like, get up when you're ready.
Yeah. Well, Brad, maybe to close, what do the both of you think from your different perspectives on this idea of this putting Calvinism into these, whether it's, I guess we're literally talking about clothes, into these new clothes, into these new environments, and if there's, I don't know if that causes tension or if it is a, as we've talked about, especially with you, Brad, if this is a model, is this the kind of making an argument you're talking about, or is this kind of something else?
I think it could count as the types of things I talk about in the book, in terms of like creating a good aesthetic for your worship services or something, right? And the thing is, it's not like Marsville did a good job and Bethlehem did a bad job. It's not that simple. It's knowing, kind of fitting the feel of your city, fitting the mood of your city. And I think sociologically, at least, that can be a positive for an evangelical church to thrive, I guess. Just think of the alternatives, right? If you have a church that is just completely at a disjuncture from the mood of the city, and the aesthetics all off, and it's just all wrong. That's another conversation to have theologically, right? So, but sociologically, it's makes sense as an organization, if you're trying to get people in the door to feel comfortable and to buy into a particular religious worldview, to make them not only comfortable, but also like impressed almost.
Pastor Michael, what do you think about this idea of, well, we know you're a confessional Presbyterian pastor, but what do you think? Is there a tension? Is there something that's going to be changed when we put Calvinism in these new clothes, whether it be the professional Manhattan, the salt of the earth Midwesterners, or the hip Starbucks employees in Seattle or whatever?
Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't want to go as far as to say it doesn't matter, and I wouldn't want to go as far as to say, well, if you're taking Calvinism, it has to look like this. So like, obviously the aesthetic, like we're talking about, the aesthetic of a church and the way it kind of flows, and like these things should be thought about intentionally, because they communicate something. Now you could say that, for instance, the fact that you walk into a church that's very different than what you would expect, that, it might be a little bit jarring, but also that could be, communicating something that, hey, they are different. There is something different about this. Maybe that's something that you want to check out. You could also say that, it's, the fact that all of us can walk into Bethlehem Baptist Church and be like, yep, it's a church. Like, there's something about that. Like, you can fit right in. Like, you're just ready to just be there, because we're Midwesterners, and that makes sense. And obviously the lowercase c Catholic Church has looked a lot of different ways at a lot of different times, while maintaining the same, or at least generally the same core teachings and doctrine. And so there's something to be said here. I just don't know what it is. I know that, so obviously these things communicate something, and you want to be intentional about them. I think you should be intentional about, the space that you're in, even the things like lighting, the things like, the kind of music that you're playing, all of these aspects that in some sense are peripheral, in that like they can change and you can still have a church, you can still have a worship service. They're not central in word and sacrament and prayer are central. But there is something to be said that, the way you do these different things, it's not neutral, and it does communicate in a different way. And so, could you say that there were ways that the aesthetic was used that contradicted in some way the fundamental teachings? Maybe. Like I'm willing to at least explore it. I don't know if I want to say yes, but I at least want to say it could have been. I mean, it could have been, part of it.
I think that is good. That right. There is a sense where Christianity, certainly the Reformed worship, as we said in a very early episode, of all you need is bread, wine, and the book. And that should be something you can port into these different cultures, and therefore doesn't need to be completely alien. And there are probably ways where if you layer too much on top, there can be a problem. But I think the other thing it points out that probably hopefully makes us all more reflective on our own churches, on our own spirituality. I don't know who said this, but it's just a great quote, is that all religion is folk religion. Right. It's not that you can't just say that, well, Mars Hill, that's a really distinct church, and this is what Brad was saying, that it's not that Bethlehem Baptist lacked, that, they all were different, that all religions in every context are influenced by the surroundings they have, right? All of us, all the religion we have is influenced by our surroundings, our upbringings, and our culture. And so which is, it's, again, it's not saying that it's completely neutral or everything's equal, but that we have to be aware of what we bring to the table, right? Maybe the reason all of us, again, as Midwesterners, well, it looks normal because that is the folk religion we're familiar with, whereas we go to these other places and that does seem distinct to us. And I think that is an important thing, and an important thing to consider as we consider how to thoughtfully worship God with the church. So I like the conversation. I found it interesting. Again, thank you, Brad, once again for joining Restless, joining Pastor Michael and I as we today we just talk about church, going to church.
Yeah, I'm always glad to join you.
Well, that was another episode of our summer interview series.
This was super fascinating. I've got a lot that I'm taking with me now, just to think about and contemplate, and even just to think about like what I'm going to do as far as in ministry and how I see ministry and how I see, the work in the local church. And
I think the conversation was long, but it was great. And so rate and review the podcast, and we will see you next week as we continue the Restless Summer.